Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today is world-renowned astrologer, Ms. Joyce Levine. Joyce, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. Now, Joyce, you and I, we have quite an interesting body of conversation to dive into today. And what we're going to be talking about is prediction within astrology and some of the predictive techniques that you use within your own practice. So I'm excited to dive into that. But before we actually do, for those of you who are new to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, this is a podcast where I bring you interviews from astrologers from around the world who are not only changing their own lives, but they're also changing the landscape of the astrology that we practice. So if you want to be a part of these conversations, and if you want to continue to be a part of the momentum and the magic that we're building here at the Oraculos True Divination podcast, please do like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, so that you can continue to be a part of what we're building here at the Oraculos True Divination podcast. Now, Joyce,
Yep.
I met you at UAC in 2018, and I honestly was not only blown away by the presentation that you did, but also blown away by your involvement in astrology and you being recognized by the NCGR in the way that you were. So can you tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about your history and how it is you found your way to be into astrology and how it is you found your way to also being a part of the NCGR?
Okay, well, we're going back a long time. When I got out of college, I was going to take like a year. I majored in psychology undergraduate, and I was going to take a year off and go to graduate school. It's a long story, but I've been working full-time and going to school full-time, and it was like time to, I mean, I didn't live home at the time, but it was sort of time to like not live that close to family. So I moved to Boston, and I had a friend who had been studying astrology that moved to Boston at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And she took me to a class. Now, meanwhile, I'm in my 20s, so it's not the most rational time in your life. And particularly, because when I was in the 20s, people weren't in the business. Everybody wanted to be spiritual. It was very different than things change, how things changed. So this friend of mine took me to an astrology class. Oh, actually, she had done my chart before that. And she told me all of these things that you don't tell people, even your closer friends. And, and I actually, once I got into astrology, I discovered she didn't even draw it upright. But it still had all of these things that, you wouldn't necessarily talk about.
Right.
And so she took me to a class, and it was Isabel Hickey at the time, who was like very famous. Of course, I didn't know who she was, because I didn't know anything about astrology at the time.
Wow.
And so, being practical and rational as I was, in that one class, I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And so it took me, I studied for 6 years before I actually went to try. I mean, I was doing I bothered everybody I knew because I think that no matter who you study with, if you don't practice, you don't learn anything.
Yeah.
So right away, even when I didn't, know anything, everybody I knew, can I do your chart? And so you learn, and then I studied with different teachers. And then, of course, you have to learn how to make money, which are not the same skills.
They are not.
When you're 20, you think, well, I'll be so good, and I'll just meditate. and let me say this, I thought this way.
Yeah.
It was a long time ago. And that, people would show up at my door. But I was actually fortunate because one of my other teachers who people don't name, whose name people don't recognize now because he didn't write any books, whose name was Oscar Weber, but He was president. He
Wow.
was president of the AFA like in the 60s. I think he was charging $200 for a chart in the 70s.
Wow.
And so he kind of took me under his wing, and he would give me anything that basically, he'd refer things to me that weren't good enough for him. And they were great for me. And so that's how I actually got started in terms of, transitioning. Because, once you've been an astrologer for a long time, word of mouth, repeat, clientele, all of that works. But when you're starting out, you need a little something to give it a push, or nobody's going to know who you are.
Yeah.
So I was very fortunate in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been doing it ever since. But it was walking into that one class was like falling in love.
Yeah. You're the second person to mention Oscar Weber to me this week because I just interviewed Mychal Adler, who wrote the book Predictive Astrology. And apparently when she was in the Massachusetts area as well, she also had the opportunity to study with Oscar Weber.
That's interesting. Because he didn't write any books, sort of people, unless they studied with him or were in the Boston area at the time, don't tend to know who he was.
Right. And what she said to me was that, didn't Oscar Weber also write something in like the Boston Herald? Like
he had a column that was not a sun sign column.
Right. That's
it was a big deal.
Yeah, that's exactly what she said. And she said that it was too expensive to get a chart reading from him. So she, instead of getting the chart reading, she started to take his classes, but she ended up paying more money on the classes than she would have paid for the one chart reading.
Well, but you learn in a class. Getting your chart done is not the same thing as learning astrology. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, which, again, the job of the astrologer is to translate astrology into English, not to talk astrology speak when you're doing a chart. Like you might mention something here and there about the planets or explain a little bit, but the purpose of a consultation is for a person to learn about themselves, not for the astrologer to show off what they know.
How is it that you came to be specifically interested in the topic of predictive techniques within astrology?
Well, let me just say this. My practice is actually more general than that. So, when you've been around long enough, you tend to look at everything. But in terms of working with clients, because I also do mundane work, but in working with clients, the birth chart is what the person is like. And you can never make predictions without understanding the birth chart. There's things that go on in the world, but they don't affect everybody equally. Mm-hmm. And so the birth chart is the basis for anything that happens to you. It's your view of the world. Right. And if you don't understand the birth chart, you can't understand anything else. Wow. So you always have to start with the birth chart. Then what's going on now? And why is this year different from last year or the year before? So it's a combination of all of those factors that really helps people not just understand what they're like, but what they're going through at a given point in time. So that's why. And I use more than one technique because I don't find that any one on its own is reliable.
So Joyce, when you're using the predictive techniques that you use, are you looking backward as well as forward, or what is your specific approach when you are consulting with clients?
I start with the birth chart. If it's a new client, I always start with the birth chart. Mm-hmm. Because the birth chart is not just what you're like, but it's the lens through which you look at the world. Mm-hmm. So you need to understand what your view is. Mm-hmm. Because most people think that either other people think like them or should.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting in relationship consultations.
Yeah.
But so I always start with the birth chart because that's what you're like.
Right.
Then after going through the birth chart, so usually the first time I see someone, it's a 2-hour consultation, and about an hour and a half of that is the birth chart. Then we look at the cycles for the next year. Mm-hmm. And when people come back for subsequent consultations, we might get more specific
Right.
into like once a month or whatever. And people come back at varying. Some people come in once a year. I suggest twice a year to look at cycles. But when people are going through difficult times, they can call once a month. So
Yeah.
I mean that literally, because at different times in your life, you need more help. On the other hand, I could not hear from somebody for 15 years, and they'll go, well, I didn't have a problem.
Yeah.
In fact, I had one client say to me, how come you never give me good news? I said, how come you only call me when you're in crisis? what do you I don't make it. I always tell people I don't make it up. I only report it. But I mean, obviously I try to be as considerate as possible.
Yeah.
But if a person is going through a difficult cycle,
Mm-hmm.
and depending on how old they are, I might go back and say, you went through something similar X amount of years ago, because that will help them understand what's going on now. If they're in the middle of something, I mean, what I really hate is when somebody comes in and things are fine and they're about to fall apart, because that's the hardest thing to deal with in terms of clients, because you're really going to deliver bad news they're not expecting, and they're not always happy with you.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're in the middle of something, I will tell them how long it's likely to last. So I won't just say, all right, we're done at the end of the year, but I might try to minimize it, or let's put it this way, not like maybe temper the shock if it's going to last a really long time. On the other, people are very different. Some people really want to know so that they can deal with things head on. Other people would rather stick their head in the sand. And so, and part of that, depending on the birth chart, also depends on how you can deliver information.
So what you're saying is that if you're dealing with someone who is very much the archetypal Aries type, you would deliver that information to them differently.
Right on.
Differently than you would to someone who is the archetypal carbon copy of, say, a Pisces type.
Exactly. Again, you might give them the same information, but you can't language it the same way.
Right.
It doesn't help people if you give them good news when it's not true.
Yeah.
Because then they're not prepared.
Yeah. Mm.
And let me just say this, sometimes people can surprise you. I remember I had one client, this is like years ago. I didn't know her very well. She came in, got her chart done, and then she had her children's charts done.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived in a very rich suburb. The husband was a bond trader. Do you know what I mean? And she had a little shop in a very expensive neighborhood. So you get the picture.
Yep.
Many people could probably retire on what their house was worth. So I'm looking at the older daughter's chart, and she's an Aries with a Sun-Mars conjunction opposite Pluto. So I'm looking at this chart and I go, this is like, the 7-year-old girl is like Attila the Hun. And I was like, a bit nervous about what I was going to say to the mother. But we went over the chart, and when I got through, the mother said two things that surprised me. One, good, I won't have to worry about her. And two, good, it's not my fault. Because the child was already acting out.
Yeah.
And so we looked at ways that would help to tone down some of the aggressiveness, like get her involved in team sports because she has to cooperate to win. Do you know what I mean? So it's all in, again, it's all in the birth chart, but the way people take it sometimes can surprise you. And parents of adult children have distance. When you're working with someone that has a baby or young children, there's not usually a lot of distance.
Joyce, I think you bring up a really important point in terms of parents and parents wanting to have astrological consultation on behalf of their children. And what I want to know from you is, how do you approach talking to the parent of a baby about that baby's chart versus talking to the parent of an adult about their adult child's chart?
I think I'm more sensitive when it's a baby. You know, I will look at ways that can help that child develop positively. So you might be looking for, like if the child with the Sun-Mars conjunction in Aries opposite Pluto. The child is aggressive. There's no way that that child's not going to be aggressive. How can you channel that aggressiveness into something that is not going to harm her?
Yeah.
In the same way, I mean, actually the same family. The mother had 2 Aries children, and then had a Taurus with the moon in Cancer.
That's me.
And so,
oh, poor child.
So, well, just from the time, children give, babies in the crib give signals to the parents, because people are not born blank slates. We're all born with our charts.
Yeah.
And then our world is going to reflect that, because it's not an accident. And so the mother comes in and she said, I don't know my friends are all telling me that there's something wrong with me. This child won't leave me. She never wants to be without me. I can't, she doesn't want me to go to work. What am I going to do? And she said, my friends are all telling me, it's you. You are, this is the last child you're going to have. You're the one that's clinging. And I look at her, I go, no, it's in the chart. So, part of that is, even, with children, it can be having the parents accept what the child's like, and also accept differences. I mean, I have other clients, and these people have been clients of mine since 1990.
Wow.
So the parents were clients of mine before they got married. I picked their wedding date. When they got engaged, and her parents, her mother was going to disown, her family was going to disown her for marrying him because it was a different ethnic background. And the mother's astrologer told her that if she married him, they'd get divorced. And
Okay.
I looked at the charts and I go, you couldn't be more perfect. And there's 30 years later, they're still married. But these are the parents are 2 people with Saturn and Capricorn, very at the top of the chart. So strong, worked for Fortune. The husband was the CEO or CFO of a Fortune 100 company, very practical, you do what you're supposed to, you work hard, you do all of those things.
Yeah.
The first child is born with a stellium, Sun, Uranus, Neptune, Mercury, all of those together between Capricorn and Aquarius. And it's like,
Wow.
your son, this kid is not like you. He's not going to do the things that you think he should. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, this woman, knew astrology, and she'd known me for a long time, so she could understand, like, okay. But the interesting thing was that her father had a chart similar to that. So it was a family dynamic, just not from the parents.
Mm-hmm.
See a lot of that. Sometimes things skip generations.
Yeah.
But it helped the mother, because she would have been the tough one, not the father, understand that, her children are not going to be like her. And she was smart enough to accept it. It's not something every parent wants to hear.
Yeah. On this point of family dynamics, which I know is also another thing that's really important to your work, I had a client just yesterday So it seems like synchronicity that we're talking about this today. But she came to me and she said, I would like a synastry reading between my chart and my father's chart. And the dad's chart didn't have a time of birth or anything. And I didn't think that synastry was probably the most appropriate thing to do. I figured I'd just look at the two charts. So he didn't have a time of birth. Hers did. So I read the father's story through her chart, and through her chart, we saw the relationship that the father had with the mother. We saw the fact that the mother tried to get away from the father but couldn't. We saw that the father wasn't there. Like, we saw so many things regarding the father and the household that he left behind needing healing. And then when we went to the father's chart, there was so many parallels between his chart and the daughter's chart. And the thing is, she never knew him because the father essentially had an affair with the mother, who was the secretary. And so he had his obligations to his own family, but she had the moon and Saturn in Pisces. The dad had this big old stellium in Pisces. He had the moon in Scorpio, and the moon was squaring the Uranus. So there seemed to be this interesting bleed through between
There
the two
always
charts.
is. There always is. But
Yeah,
it can skip a generation.
yeah, yeah.
But
Wow.
you will always find family patterns. In fact, I mean, when I look at a person's chart, one of the things I look at in the birth chart is what their family life was like. And I look at that through their chart
Yes,
because it's not an accident. In
yes.
fact, one of the examples I use when I'm lecturing for family dynamics is the Clintons. Because if you look at Chelsea Clinton's chart, you can see both her father and her mother and how they got along and everything else in that chart. And,
Wow.
and the reason I use their chart is because people know who they are.
Yeah,
But in anybody's chart, it's not an accident that you're born into a certain family. And that the thing is that people have to remember that that's their vision of the family.
yeah,
A sibling can have a completely different chart and a completely different vision. Like if you talk to my sister and I about how we grew up, you think we lived in different households. And you
I,
see that a lot. And you particularly see it in large families where the oldest almost invariably has a strong Saturn, got stuck with all the responsibilities. The youngest has a strong Jupiter, got spoiled. Um, you know, you just see it over and over.
yeah.
So that your life's not an accident.
Hmm.
I mean, I used to think we had a lot more free will when I was younger.
You're preaching to the choir. And this topic of fate versus free will, I feel as if it's following me around like a plague because I'm a destiny sort of person. And I tend to be more a fate oriented sort of person. It keeps on coming up again to the point where I feel as if I need to specifically do a podcast that addresses this concept of fate versus free will and whether or not it is actually fate versus free will and not some dynamic interplay between the
I
two.
think there's a dynamic between. I have a book for you, which is not an astrology book. It's called Blueprint.
Okay.
It's Robert Plotkin or something like that. It's about genetics and the percentage of things that are inherited and aren't. Temperament is inherited. Whether you tend to be depressed, you have a strong Saturn, or you tend to be optimistic, you have a strong Jupiter. I mean, he doesn't talk astrology. That's my input on his book. But it's very interesting because that whole thing of nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
At one point, like everybody thought everything was nurture. But they've done so many studies of twins that were separated at birth that they grew up alike, or they married the same kind of people, or even sometimes with the same names.
Wow.
It just you can't. I saw a play years and years ago when I was in England called Blood Brothers, and it was basically, I mean, it's very British because it would have not have been an American point of view. It was really how you can't escape your fate. But it was about how two brothers separated at birth. One stayed with the birth mother who was poor. One, was adopted by somebody rich, and the fate that brought them together, which was tragic. But it was just so, the whole thing of you can't escape your fate. I mean, but I think we have choices within what we're like, but we can't choose what we're not like. That's the way I would put it.
Wow. Okay, Joyce, we're going to have to.
We're getting very off topic.
Right. Right. I was just going to say, we're going to have you come back to talk about this topic of family dynamics and astrology, because it's a fascinating topic, and it's something that I've spent a great deal of my own time investigating within my client charts, and I'm putting together a body of work regarding the same topic of family dynamics and astrology. So we definitely want to have you back to talk to us about that. Now, getting back to predictive techniques. So Joyce, what I want to know is, what are the specific predictive techniques that you use and why?
Okay. I mean, I use transits. Everybody uses transits.
Yeah.
Okay, and transits in relationship to, where planets are in this. For those who may or may not, I don't know how sophisticated astrologically your audience is.
They're sophisticated.
Okay. Transits are the relationship of the planets in the sky. It's the relationship of the planets in your chart. So I use all transits. And the strength of the transit depends on how long it lasts. So if you have a moon transit, you might be happy or upset for about an hour. Okay, if you have a Pluto transit, you may not want to get out of bed for 2 or 3 years. So again, it depends. The intensity depends on the planet, and also depends on the aspect. And the hard aspects, which are conjunctions, squares, oppositions, and I also use semi-squares and sesi-quadrats, which they are the most powerful.
Amen.
The conjunction being the most. Like if you get a trine, maybe something will happen if you activate it, or good aspects. I call them opportunity with effort, even if it's a trine. Mm-hmm. Because unless those planets are connected in your birth chart, nothing is going to happen. Mm-hmm. But if you know it's there, you might, you can activate it.
Right.
And so most people under Pluto transits go through, everybody likes to make things nice. Okay, you're going to be transformed. What it really means is, you're going to go through hell and you'll come out the other side. And maybe you'll be transformed, or maybe you'll feel like you're dead. But, I mean, obviously I'm being a bit facetious here, but, it's under a Pluto transit, usually you are confronted with whatever you need to be confronted with about your life. And again, different signs react to different transits or different cycles differently. Like I remember Pluto came to my son in the 80s, and I thought, oh, this is my ruling planet. I am not going to have any trouble with Pluto. What I have found is that the more people think their life is together, the worse of the time they have with Pluto. I mean, things were going great for me when Pluto was on my son. up until Pluto was on my son.
Wow.
And so the other thing is, I think fixed signs don't like change.
Right.
So whereas a mutable sign with a Pluto transit would say, okay, I need to adapt. Our cardinal sign might say, I'm unhappy, but I got to do something. A fixed sign is going to say, I'm holding onto this with dear life. I don't want that change.
I'm that person.
Well, you said you were a Taurus, and I'm a Scorpio. But I always say Taurus is the most stubborn sign of the zodiac. They just do it so nicely that people don't. It takes a while for people to get it. They do it with such charm or such graciousness that you can have this wonderful conversation with them, and you think something's going to change, and then nothing does. Um,
Uh,
but fixed signs in general don't like change. So they are going to be more resistant to when something comes along and requires it.
yeah.
Um, on the other hand, I think the most dangerous planet is Neptune because you don't know what you're doing. I mean, Neptune is great for spirituality. It's great for creativity. But Neptune is also fog and illusion. And usually with clients, I don't tell them what to do. Usually I just give them all the information and let them make decisions. But if I see Neptune transiting somebody's seventh house, I tell them not to get married till that transit's over.
Yeah.
Not the whole time it's in the seventh house, just when it's opposing the ascendant, because you just don't know what you're getting. And you'll wake up when it moves away from the ascendant.
Yeah.
And I've had clients that didn't listen to me. Of course, it's romantic, you're in love. Why would you listen? You want the romance. I said, have the romance, just don't get married. And 3 years later, the client who didn't listen to me calls me back when she's getting a divorce.
Yeah.
So I think Neptune is the most dangerous from that standpoint because you really don't know what you're not aware. Actually, for a fixed sign, I actually have Uranus been opposing my sun lately. I actually like Uranus, which is unusual for a fixed sign, but I like it because I guess maybe because I have a lot of fire in my chart. I'm a fire-water combination, nothing rational. It's true. You wouldn't be an astrologer all your life if you were particularly,
That is true as well.
But Uranus forces you to be true to yourself. Now, either you do it willingly or your life gets disrupted. So either you make the changes that you need to make or life will make them for you. Like I've seen people with Uranus transits that, my husband left me. I go, but this is your transit. He left you because you wouldn't get out. You weren't willing to make the change, so it got made for you. Or people get in car accidents. They hate their job, but they won't change because they're making too much money. And so something happens that takes them out of that situation. Now, if you're being true to yourself, then, I think people have a different experience. It can still be the unexpected, but it's not quite as catastrophic. In the same way with Saturn transits, Saturn's a planet of reality, whether we like it or not. Saturn is not spiritual. Pluto is the planet of fate. What's ever not meant to be in your life is going to go. And you won't really get to,
Wow.
you won't get a choice. It's not whether you've done a good job or a bad job, or you've been a good person or a bad person. It's about, okay, that's done for you.
Wow.
Saturn is the planet that tends to give you what you deserve, one way or the other. So if you have a Pluto transit and you lose your job, the planet closed. Okay, if you have a Saturn transit and you lose your job, you probably weren't living up to expectations. However, whether those expectations are reasonable or not may be a different question. But Saturn is the planet of the Earth plane, of reality. It's not Neptune's reality, which is the heavens. See, I think of Neptune like if we were in heaven, everybody would be spiritual and wonderful, and you wouldn't have to watch your wallet. But we're on Earth. So we're under Saturn's domain. And so that's where you're supposed to play by the rules. And if you have a strong Saturn in your chart, you can't help but be responsible, even if you don't want to be. Unfortunately, Saturn is not by sign, but Saturn is the planet that's aspected just about everything else in my chart. It's the only trine I have. which is like, is that fair? But it's the way it goes. Jupiter is the planet of abundance and opportunity, but Jupiter is the planet of expansion. If it's triggering something good, it will get better. But but expansion doesn't always mean good; it just means more. And if somebody makes me a promise, I'd rather have them see have a strong Saturn and a strong Jupiter.
Clear as day.
You know, there was a book written, and I don't know whether you've ever heard of it. It came out long before you were born, called The Road Less Traveled. It was on the bestsellers list for about 25 years.
No, haven't heard of it.
And he talked about people either, I can't remember how he put it, but I equated it to Jupiter and Saturn people. You know, the Saturn is like, you know, you're responsible, and you know, it's your responsibility, and it's sort of like your fault. The Jupiter is, you know, I'm the good, you know, life is supposed to be good. And you know, and you see people, particularly if they have strong Jupiter, Neptune, and a weak Saturn, they're great visionaries, but don't ask them to do anything. Don't be there when something needs to get done. Again,
Yep.
Every chart has its pluses and its minuses, and obviously you can have both a Saturn and Jupiter that are in decent shape.
Mm-hmm.
But Jupiter is the planet of opportunity. But think of it as Saturn is the planet of limits. The walls and the ceilings are limits. Now, maybe in the Bahamas, you know, you don't really need them that much. But I'm in Cambridge. You know? I don't want to be out in the snow. So the walls and the ceilings are Saturn.
Yeah.
You know, Saturn can be protection, or barriers can be protection as well as limits.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, that's sort of how I look at the planets. And then, of course, you look at what they're doing, and you look at the condition of the birth chart. Because you can be getting a harsh aspect from something, but if those planets are well aspected in your birth chart, you're not likely to get the same kind of problem that somebody or that has those planets intention aspected to begin with. So you always have to look at the birth chart for what's likely to happen.
Yeah.
And how will you take it? You know, Sagittarius gets a Saturn transit, they're not happy. A Capricorn gets a Saturn transit, it's like, okay, what do I need to do?
Yeah.
So, you know, it really depends on what the person is like to begin with.
Joyce, that was an amazing description of the slower moving planets in relation to how they affect our charts by transit. But can you talk to us about the other predictive techniques that you use? Because I know that before we went on air, you also mentioned that you use secondary progressions as well as solar arc directions. So can you speak to us about that, please?
Sure. I use secondary progressions in two ways. One, I use it as when planets move by secondary direction into a different sign, there's like an overlay to what you're like. So for instance, my sun is in Scorpio. When it moved into Sagittarius was the first time I did international travel. I wasn't interested in it before then. Or you take somebody who say their sun is at 0 degrees of Aries. You know, they're like, get out of my way. They turn 30 and the progressed sun goes into Taurus, and people start going, gee, you've calmed down so much, you must have matured. Okay, so that your things, it's not like you get rid of the birth chart, but you add another dimension. Mm-hmm. When my progressed sun went into Capricorn, I started studying the stock market, which I'd never been interested in before. And interestingly enough, Grace Morris, who I don't know if you know who she is, but she's a very good financial astrologer, said it is a Scorpio also. And she said she started studying the stock market when her progressed sun went into Capricorn. I had no earth in my birth chart. You know, it's like, so when planets change signs by progression, it changes the way you look at things. So I have no earth in my birth chart. And when planets first moved into Earth, I don't care about money. I just want to do what I want. I'm serious. I lived in a dumpy rent control apartment and it didn't bother me. I'm actually serious. planets went into Earth, and I went, what am I doing living here? I mean, it's particularly noticeable if you don't have anything of that element.
Right.
But even when planets move into a different sign, a Pisces has their progressed sun move into Aries, and all of a sudden they start standing up for themselves more. And I shouldn't say all of a sudden, because it's over time. You know, it's not like you wake up one day and go, okay, now I'm different because my sun just progressed into a different sign. But you will start to notice changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
The moon changes signs every 2.5 years. And so you will notice a change. Progressed moon goes into Virgo, you start getting neater. You know, the only time I was ever good with growing plants was my progressed moon was in Taurus. It's true. The cats killed them after that. But so that you'll notice, or all of a sudden, you know, you start like being attracted to red clothes. Your progressed moon's in Leo. You know, but you will notice a change in taste. Again, it doesn't change everything.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, when a planet goes from retrograde to direct or direct to retrograde, if it happens in your birth chart, the year that happens, you will over time you'll start to see a change in the way that planet is utilized, you know, by you.
Mm-hmm.
And so with progressions, I pay attention to all of those things.
Okay.
In addition, I used to think that progressions were only psychological, but then I had enough experience and I had to revise my opinion. Progressions, particularly conjunctions. I mean, a progression from the moon is only going to last a month or something. It's not. I don't really pay that much attention to that unless I'm looking at the month to month.
Yeah.
But when something goes into a new sign, or you know, like my progressed sun conjuncted Jupiter, the sun by progression in solar arc is the same. Just every other planet is different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I took the last of my student. I took out of student loan and went to Europe on the money. Not practical.
Yeah.
So you start to see how those things happen for people. Solar arcs are different.
Yes.
Well, for people that may or may not know what secondary progressions are, it's like you move. I mean, you can obviously with a computer you can just calculate this on the computer. But if you just, for people that still have ephemerises, and I recommend that everybody has an ephemeris no matter what your computer is like.
Yes.
But it's roughly equivalent to a day for a year. So if you're 30 years old, you look at 30 days after your birthday, and that's where your progressed planets are. The moon is the only thing that won't be, you know.
Yeah.
You know, obviously they're moving all year, so it's not exact at that point, but just as a general. The solar arc direction, you move every planet in your chart forward the same degree as you're moving the sun forward. So if you're if somebody is 2 years old, you move every planet in the chart 2 degrees. Now, all the angular relationships are going to stay the same because the aspects aren't changing, just the degrees.
Mm-hmm.
For solar arcs, I only use hard aspects. You don't get trines, you don't get you don't get sextiles. The conjunctions, the square, the oppositions, the semi-square, the sesi-quadrant, that's it.
Yep.
And it tends to be particularly event-oriented. Like, I was talking to actually another astrologer who did not use solar arcs, and he was telling me at the time someone very close to him died, all he had was trines from Pluto, and I said, I don't think so. I looked at his chart for that time. He had directions. He had solar arc directions from Pluto all over the place for years. You miss things.
Yeah.
If something is really significant, it is going to show in more than one way, and sometimes you don't see it in transits. But when you have the when everything agrees, then you know it's either really favorable or really a challenge. But it's a combination of all of those things.
You know, Joyce, my own background in astrology is that I am rigorously trained classical Renaissance, but at the same time, I'm also deeply trained in Uranian astrology. So I have these two perspectives of astrological technique. And when I hear you speaking, and specifically the piece that you're saying about only using hard aspects, that's something that we really hold true within the context of Uranian astrology, that we only use.
I'm not an expert at Uranian astrology, but I do know it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's something that we hold true within the context of Uranian astrology, that if something is going to happen, you're going to see that happening by your hard aspects, especially the semi-square and the sesquiquadrate. Like, a lot of people don't pay enough attention to the half squares and the sesquiquadrates, but they actually do pack a humongous punch. And if we integrate those not only into our natal predictive work, but also into just how we approach natal astrology in general, that sesquiquadrate and that semi-square is going to give you far more information than just using the traditional Ptolemaic aspects.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember years ago, this is like many years ago, I had a friend who was quite ill, and she had cancer. And she was an astrologer. And other astrologers were saying she can't die because she only has semi-squares and sesquiquadrates, which was unfortunately not true.
Yeah.
She had Pluto all over the place. But she was cardinal and Pluto wasn't fixed, but it was the semi-square and the sesquiquadrate that just kept going over everything in the chart. And so you miss things.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think a conjunction is always the most powerful. So, but it doesn't mean you can rule everything else out.
And I definitely think that there's a lot of astrologers who have a very strong astrological basis and a very rich approach to their astrology. But like you said, you miss things, especially if you're not wanting to explore the use of a technique based on whatever, people tend to hold themselves stuck in these boxes that say, oh, I'm not going to use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. I'm not going to use the half squares and the sesquiquadrates. I'm not going to look at the quincunx. But these various things that we tend to push away from our astrology can oftentimes be some of the most illuminating.
Well, I won't repeat online what I think of not using Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. I mean, I heard somebody delineate Bill Gates' chart once that didn't use Pluto. And she was going over why he made so much money. Bill Gates has a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the second house, which is money. I mean, come on. Do you know what I mean? It's like, what else do you need to look for? I mean,
yeah.
And he's got Uranus rising. He's in technology. It's like, hello. I mean, granted, there were other things in the chart, but nothing that powerful.
I think that we still have a long way to go in terms of our astrology. And while it is important for us to have a connection to where it is we've come from, it's also important for us to blaze a trail forward into the future and find a skillful way to use some of the things that the 21st century has given us in terms of astrological technique and practices.
Well, Lily didn't use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto because they weren't discovered yet. I mean, let's be realistic. I mean, you can't use what you don't know exists.
Yeah.
In fact, I've just started working with Eris because she's newly discovered, and I just, what do you do with Eris? It's like she's in a sign for so long, but now she's squaring Pluto, and she's also on my moon, so I figured I'd better understand her. I was a troublemaker before that, but it's like you learn things by watching. I remember when I first got into astrology, Isabel Hickey wasn't using Pluto.
Yeah. And I remember that from her book, actually. It was something that she added as an appendix to the book that she wrote, but she didn't actually integrate it into the body of the book that she wrote.
Yeah, I think when the book was rewritten, it was put in, I think. I don't remember. but
Yeah.
I think I still have the signed copy from her somewhere.
Okay. And, truthfully, I am personally a bit on the fence when it comes to Eris as well, because I think that there was a lot of hoopla about Eris when she was first discovered. So, I mean, I don't know what to do with Eris, but I think that what you said about we learn through watching, I think that's the most important thing that an astrologer in the 21st century can hear, because that's really what our astrology is about. Our astrology isn't about holding on to archaic, well, let me be politically correct with what I'm about to say, but our astrology isn't about getting stuck within one period. Our astrology is about learning about the cosmos by watching the cosmos. And if the cosmos has so availed itself to allow us to see something else that's within it, or something else that's orbiting our sun, the only way that we can begin to understand that thing is by watching it, not only through our charts, but through hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of charts of other people, so that we can begin to create language around that thing. So if you're doing that with Eris, I think that that's really great, because I think a lot of people have just started to talk about Eris as a planetoid, but they haven't actually done the work of learning about Eris through watching what she does. And so kudos to you.
Well, she moves so slowly that you got to be careful, because she's been in Aries for, I actually don't know when she went into Aries. Before I open my mouth, I should look that up. But I mean, she's been in Aries for well over 70 years,
Yeah.
and is not anywhere near out. It just,
Yeah.
again, because she's on my moon, I think it was sort of, she started talking to me.
Good.
But that, I mean, if we look at everything that's going on now with that Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto conjunction, and Eris right now is exactly square Pluto. But I think, nobody has time to do everything. It's just the way, there's so many things to look at in astrology, you have to make choices.
Yeah.
But I'd actually like to get just back to a comment about the Uranian, because I'm not a Uranian astrologer. However, when I do mundane work, I look at the Uranian in addition to the natal. And that, not this last eclipse, but the one before it, where the sun was conjunct Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody thought this was such a wonderful eclipse. And I looked at it, and Pluto was, not Pluto,
Hades.
Hades was at the top of the chart for Washington, opposing that Sun Jupiter. And I'm like, this is not a good eclipse. So, sometimes I find that while I don't normally use the Iranian planets in client work, because
Yeah.
there's only so much you can deal with. And even my rates are not cheap, but they're not high enough to go through all of that to spend that kind of time. But there was a client who had Pluto transits, and she was going through a tough time, and she had Pluto squaring her sun in the 8th house. And then her father was dying, and she had all of these other things. But also, she owned a piece of property, which was her inheritance, that had a major fire. And that was her income. That it wasn't well insured. I mean, it was like all of this terrible thing, but it had, I forget what the picture was, but Zeus was involved. And so that, there were fireworks.
Yeah.
Nothing else in the chart specifically said fireworks.
But the Zeus.
It
Wow.
was opposing or ascendant at the time. I don't use it normally, but I do look at it in mundane work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that in mundane astrology is really a place where Uranian astrology does shine very brightly. And I'm definitely going to be bringing on some of the top Uranian astrologers in the world to have that discussion. But once again, we have to learn through observation, and we have to observe how these things work within our own practice, our own client work, in order for us to come up with the most grounded and really intelligent understanding of whether or not these things are applicable to astrology or not?
Well, I mean, even I haven't been teaching in a while, but I should go back to it. But I always tell my students, test everything. Don't believe anything anybody says, including me,
Yeah.
unless you can see that it works.
Yeah.
Because there's so much junk out there, or there's so many things that people make important that are like, you might give 5 minutes if you were looking at something. You might notice it, but it's not the most important thing in the chart. But again, what's important? Astrology is a symbolic language, and different symbols speak to different people.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think it depends on what kind of astrology you're practicing. I mean, nobody's going to come to me for a consultation about their past life. Now that's just not what I do. I think the life you need to deal with is the one you're living here. But if that's what you want, there are astrologers that will, you can find for that. It doesn't do anything for me. Not that I didn't study all of that stuff in the 70s. But, again, I think that there needs to be a match between the client and the astrologer.
Yeah, and that's also something that I believe to be absolutely true. The clients who are for us, they are the clients that find us. And even if we don't have every single technique under our belts, the clients who come to us, they need what it is we have gained some proficiency in. And I think that that becomes a really important thing for astrologers to know, especially young astrologers coming into the field, that if you've done the groundwork and you've done your ABCs and you have a strong grasp of the fundamentals of astrology, you're going to get people who come to you at the level that you're capable of practicing at. And you'll also get some people who are able to push you one step forward and who cause you to have to learn that next thing that's going to take you further in your practice.
Well, I think we all develop over time. Mm-hmm. And the one thing about astrology is that no matter how much you know, there's always something you don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's never ending.
Definitely. Okay. So, Joyce Levine, we have gone through several rabbit holes today, and I feel like Alice in Wonderland because I'm not sure when the Cheshire Cat is going to jump out, but you have some...
My cats have not come in the room. I have two beautiful Maine Coons. That would be an asset to any video.
So, Joyce, you have some charts that you're going to show us right now. And these charts, I believe, are from a presentation that you did before on how to skillfully integrate the transits, the secondary progressions, and the solar arc directions.
Yeah. So I've actually just pulled out one, which was Robert De Niro's from when he won the Oscars.
Wow. Okay, let's take a look at that.
Okay, so the first thing that I do if I'm looking at something is want to understand the birth chart. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't understand the birth chart, you can't possibly know what's going to be promised. So if we just a little bit, I mean, most people know who Robert De Niro is, but he's won 2 Oscars. He's had a lot of successful movies, but he's only won 2 Oscars. And he won them early in his career. So why? So the question is, one, what makes him successful? And then, what makes him, in a sense, a good actor? And then why did he win those Oscars at that particular point in time? Just for background. Mm-hmm. His moon is in Pisces. And to me, the moon itself represents the parents or the message you get from your family. So it's not necessarily your biological parents. Do you know what I mean? It's more like the message that you take from the family environment. Mm-hmm. His moon is in Pisces, and so his parents were both painters. His father was gay, but the message that he would have got taken out of that environment to some degree would have been to be creative. Maybe to be spiritual. The problem when you're looking at famous people's charts is that you don't really, you haven't had a conversation with them unless you happen to know them.
Right.
So you don't really, know for certain exactly. He's got Cancer rising. It said he was shy when he was a kid. but he found acting. And to me, the two signs that are most associated with acting, although obviously not every actor has this combination,
Right.
are Leo and Pisces. So Leo is the actor, the star. You always know who a Leo actor is. It's their persona. But in his case, his moon is in Pisces, and the moon also rules the ascendant. And Pisces is the chameleon. Pisces is the actor that loses himself in the part, so you don't know who he is from part to part.
Mm.
And certainly De Niro has that quality. He also has a Venus-Mercury conjunction. Get this here. In Virgo.
Mm-hmm.
That's the detail orientation. And he was a method actor. In Venus and Mercury square Saturn. It's like you do it right. You learn the right techniques. Well, here's, I know, I guess that is my male cat who loves to be between me and the monitor. He's a Maine Coon with the Sun-Mars conjunction in Sagittarius, Leo rising. Speaking of the star, and the moon in Aries, all fire. And the sun square Uranus and Saturn, so I can't tell you. So if we go back to De Niro's chart, and he's got the Pisces is on the midheaven, which is, you'd expect somebody to be involved in something creative or something spiritual. Again, none of these things always work. So I just want to say, you kind of want to be careful about making rules of these things. But he's a great example. And Venus and Neptune straddle the fourth house cusp and oppose the midheaven. So we have all of that symbology. The other thing is, he's lucky. He has a Jupiter-Pluto node conjunction in the second house. It's a very nice combination for making money. Okay, so it's one thing to be good at your craft, it's something else to actually get paid for it.
Yeah.
So if we go to, where's the cat again? Oh. I don't know whether you're going to edit those out or keep them in, but all right, we got to move. The other thing I wanted to mention, Jupiter also rules, if we tie in the second house and the 10th house and the sixth house. Jupiter rules the sixth house, which is day-to-day work. If you use co-rulerships, it also co-rules the midheaven, right? Mostly use Neptune, but sometimes I will look at the other ruler. So that points to, in addition to making money, that there could be, I don't know, call it some honors there. And Jupiter's in Leo in the second. If we drop the chart for the secondary chart for April 8th, 1975, which is the day of the awards. And so one of the things that you want to remember is people are voting for the awards before they get them. So we're picking a day and time, but that's not necessarily the day that the voting took. That's definitely not the day the voting took place. But if we look at the secondary progressions at that point in time, what do we see? His progressed ascendant is conjuncting Jupiter almost exactly, like within 2 minutes. Okay, so when did he get the honors? When was the luck? When was he awarded? Now, at that time, transiting Saturn was at 12 degrees of Cancer, which was it was retrograde, so it had conjuncted his ascendant. And one of the things I want to point out, because one of the things that I completely disagree with, that most astrologers will tell you, is that Saturn below the horizon, it's like, forget anybody recognizing you or noticing you. It's only when it comes to the top of the chart that you get noticed. Let's put it this way. I have found no consistent evidence that that's true. I mean, most astrologers will consider that blasphemy. But here he is, Saturn conjunct the ascendant, should be obscure.
Mm-hmm.
No obscurity here. Transiting Saturn at the time that he won the award was at 12 degrees of Cancer, but it was retrograde. So it had already been his ascendant and moving backwards.
Clear.
So at the time it was in the 12th house, but conjunct the ascendant. Transiting Jupiter was at 5 degrees of Aries. So it was in the 10th house. But during the voting time, it was probably around his midheaven and opposing his sun. I don't know how long the voting takes.
Yeah.
Transiting Neptune at the time was at 11 degrees of Sagittarius. So it's in his 6th house, which is work. It rules his midheaven, which is career. And it's trining his Leo planets. But he's also trining that Jupiter. Those aspects, the transits by themselves, to me, don't indicate winning an award. The Jupiter in the 10th house is nice. If you were going to actually pick who was going to win the award ahead of time, you'd have to know everybody's birth time. So a lot of times you don't have that. But there we are with the solar arc. The progressed ascendant conjunct in Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
Tied in with the 6th house and the 10th house. And once you win an Oscar, your income goes up. So very nice tie-ins there.
Yeah.
I also want to point out that his progressed sun was squaring Saturn. And so, many people would say, and the progressed sun and the solar arc are the same, so that would be a loss.
Right.
But in his birth chart, his sun and Saturn are sextile. Okay, so this is why you got to be careful. And don't always consider a hard aspect is like a Saturn aspect or a hard aspect to Saturn, that something's going to go wrong. Now, we don't know anything about what was going on in his personal life at the time. This is one of the things that you always want to recognize. Like, we're looking at somebody famous's chart, so I don't have the data for, was there something going on that made you miserable that I would have with a client? But things can happen simultaneously. So you could have something great going on in your chart, and you could get a promotion and have a divorce the same year.
Yeah.
One doesn't deny the other. And that's one of the things that when you're working with clients that you really want to be careful of, because you want to point out what the opportunities are, even in the midst of the crisis, or in the midst of the problem. Okay, so now if we go to put in the solar arcs, his solar arc Uranus is conjunct the ascendant. This is for March 31st, 1981. Okay, you're a Uranian, so I'm sure that you use this. But his sun is at 29, Virgo 59. So it's basically 0 Libra, which is the world point.
The cardinal axis,
Axis is the world point. So his sun is on the world point. It's conjunct Neptune. Neptune rules the midheaven. So, that's very good.
So was this also a year that he won an award?
This is when he won his second Academy Award. This one was for, I don't know if you ever saw these movies. This one was for Raging Bull.
No, I never saw Raging Bull, actually.
It wasn't the easiest. Oh, the first one was for The Godfather. I should have mentioned that.
Okay.
Where he won Best Supporting Actor. He played Vito Corleone when he was young.
Yeah.
I think most people have seen The Godfather. Then maybe I should maybe I should find examples that more young people could see. It just that this example is so perfect.
So Joyce, would you say that this solar arc chart then serves as a magnifying glass of sorts to pinpoint something very specific going on within his life at this moment?
Absolutely. But again, you want to look at everything together. I mean, I think that's my whole point, is that you don't want to look at things in isolation.
Right, right.
And sometimes one technique will show more than another. But it's the combination that gives you the bigger picture. I mean, that's really my point.
And that combination is really looking at the transits, looking at the secondary progressions, and looking at the solar arc chart as a unit.
Exactly. And you'll find it time and time again when you look at something dramatic that's happened in someone's life. Like, most of the time our lives don't change.
Yeah.
I mean, which may be fortunate or unfortunate, depending on what your chart is like. But, most years you have certain things going on, but people's lives don't necessarily dramatically change. But I would say particularly the first Oscar, even though he was very popular as an actor before that, but the first, you win an Oscar and it changes how you're perceived. Then you become the great actor. This is 6 years apart. He had other roles in between. But the point of this is really, why now? Why then? And I think that's the biggest point. Whether it's the secondary progression or whether it's the solar arc, the sun is going to be the same. And so there we have the sun at the world's point, conjunct Neptune, ruling the midheaven.
Yeah.
In this chart, the progressed ascendant, remember in the earlier chart, the progressed ascendant was conjunct Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
In this chart, the progressed ascendant is conjunct the node.
Yeah.
And I would like to point out that 15 fixed is a reflex point for the world point, which is 0 Aries.
Yes,
so it's 45 degrees. And so we have the sun with Neptune on the world point, Neptune ruling the midheaven, the progressed ascendant at 15 Leo with the north node, again at the reflex point for the world point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty nice indication of doing something.
Yes, it is.
Where you're going to be famous.
Yes,
or you're going to be in the spotlight in the world.
So for those of our listeners who are unfamiliar with this concept of the Aries point or the world point, the Aries point is essentially 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs, and collectively we call that point 0 Aries, or the Aries point. So that would be 0 Aries, 0 Cancer, 0 Libra, 0 Capricorn. We would call all of that the Aries point on the 90-degree dial. And what Joyce was mentioning earlier about 15 of the fixed signs being a reflection point for that Aries point, that means that 15 degrees of all of the fixed signs is going to either be the semi-square or the sesquiquadrate to the Aries point. So in this chart, Robert De Niro is having not only Neptune on the Aries point proper, because he has Neptune at 0 degrees cardinal, but if we give it an orb of about 1 degree on either side, the sun here at 29 degrees Virgo is also within orb of the Aries point.
Let me just point out, the sun is actually 29:59 if you add the minutes. Okay, so it's really like right there.
Right. So the sun here is 29:59. So it is within 1 minute of arc of the Aries point. So it's there. And also the ascendant, this is the secondary progressed ascendant, is on that Aries point because it's 15 fixed, and 15 fixed equals 0 cardinal, as well as his natal node is 15 fixed, as well as the secondary progressed Mercury is on the Aries point, as well as the secondary progressed Neptune is on the Aries point as well, within that same 1 degree of orb. Wow.
And secondary progressed Mercury is conjunct Neptune.
Exactly.
It's conjunct the progressed Neptune and applying to the conjunction of the natal Neptune.
Wow. The Aries point, in a sense, represents that which brings you out into the world. So, insofar as this chart is concerned, we have these planets and these points, the ascendant, the node, the Neptune, the sun, the Mercury, essentially bringing Robert De Niro out into the world and putting him someplace where he becomes highly visible.
Exactly. Okay, so the solar arc on this, the sun's the same. So we have all of the same, that doesn't change. In this case, the secondary is, in a sense, more powerful than the solar arcs. However, the solar arc sun is still the progressed sun. And we also have solar arc Uranus conjunct the ascendant. Again, sometimes one shows more than the other. The transits at the time, transiting Pluto was sextile the sun. Transiting Pluto at the time was 23 Libra. It had turned retrograde on like before this at 24. So basically, the transiting Pluto by station was sextiling the sun, which does make it more powerful. Uranus was sextile Neptune by transit. It was 29 Scorpio. It had stationed at 0 Sag, like slightly before this. Transiting Saturn was at 6 Libra, sextile Pluto, exactly. And transiting Jupiter was sextile Pluto. But again, all of those transits, there's nothing in those transits that you would say is an Oscar winner. There's nothing in those transits that you would say makes him stand out at that point in time. And again, for those people that say you can't, when Saturn is below the horizon by transit, you're obscure, Saturn is still below the horizon here. So, for me, the point of all of this is when you're combining techniques, you come up with a picture that you would not see otherwise. I don't have this chart here, but there's 2 birth times for Trump. One is the 1054 time, which was supposedly the birth certificate time, and the other is the rectified time, and it was the time that other people are using, and the time that I guess came from his mother at a different age. The birth certificate time puts him at 1054 in the morning, and he won the election when his progressed ascendant for that time was conjunct Jupiter. Obviously not everybody has Jupiter in the second house, so it's nice for you if you do. But for people who are who people have planets in the second house, for anybody, pay attention when the ascendant by progression or solar arc comes to those planets, because that will be a change over year. In the same way, if you have planets in the 10th house, when does the midheaven, get to those planets?
Right.
And you will tend to find a changeover time frame in people's lives, as well as, again, if you're dealing with people that are actually your clients, not that I wouldn't like Robert De Niro for a client, but, you can track like what is going to be a more significant time frame for them, whether it's favorable or challenging. So that's sort of the point of putting it all together.
Yeah.
And I used De Niro because it was 2 different years. He was the perfect example, and he also, the whole thing of forget Saturn when it's below your horizon. I just don't find, I have not found that to be true.
Joyce, thank you so much for showing us these charts today and guiding us through these examples, because it was really informative and it was also really educational to see how you integrate not just one aspect of predictive technique, but 3 aspects of predictive techniques, and how through their integration, we actually begin to create this composite image of this moment in time for the life of the person that becomes a lot more nuanced than if we were to just take one thing and run with it. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you for being here. This has been fun.
Joyce, it was such an absolute pleasure having you here today on the Oraculos Truth of Nation podcast. And I surely learned a lot. And I also learned a lot about what astrology was like back
when we had to hand calculate charts.
Yeah.
I didn't,
Yeah.
There were not computer programs when I started.
So I can only imagine how much work it must have been to work with client after client and also be hand calculating those charts the entire time. you have nothing but respect for me. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Now, Joyce, I do want to hold up your book, Breakthrough Astrology, for our listeners to see. This is Joyce's book, Breakthrough Astrology, and on the cover it has Mychal Luton saying that this is the hot ticket item for astrology in the 21st century. So, if you haven't gotten a copy of Joyce's book, please do yourself a favor. You can go over to Amazon and purchase a copy there. And Joyce, is there anything else that you have going on or anything that you're working on that you want our viewers and listeners to know about?
Not at the moment, but I do have a free newsletter for people who are interested. You can sign up on my website, which is joycelevine.com.
Okay.
And I have to say it comes out when the spirit moves me. I am not as consistent as Mychal is in terms of doing anything.
Yeah.
And it's really, more for, like sometimes there'll be like a hot article for astrologers, but sometimes it'll be things that are more geared towards clients. So, but anybody that's interested, can find that there. And I'm always available for consultations, particularly now that I can't go anywhere.
Right.
We're still on mostly social distancing in Massachusetts. Things are not open yet, or I would have had a haircut.
Well, it's always best to be safe, especially during times like these. So for those of you who do want to also get a reading with Joyce, because I'm sure that after this episode, people are really keen to have you work with their charts in the very holistic and integrated way that you do. So for those of you who want to get a reading with Joyce, please do visit her website at www.joycelevine.com. And I'm going to put all of Joyce's contact information down in the description box below so that you can work with Joyce Levine. Joyce, once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for everything that you've done for astrology, and thank you for continuing to be one of the shining lights within our field, because you were doing it long before any of us millennials had access to any of this information, and we've largely come into the world that you helped to pioneer. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And to our listeners out there, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for continuing to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're cultivating here at the Oraculos True Divination podcast. If you haven't done so already, please do give yourself the opportunity to not only like this video, but also subscribe to the True Divination podcast so that you can continue to receive and be in the loop when I bring you more interviews with amazing astrologers from around the world, such as Joyce Levine. So until next time, everyone, thank you once again for being here. I love you from the bottom of my heart. Be well, be safe, and see you soon. Bye-bye. Joyce Levine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This was amazing, Joyce.